Thank you, Katie. And thanks, AJ, and everyone for having me. This is a fun opportunity to talk a little bit more about the recreation project and what we do. I'll just give a brief background of myself. So like Katie said, I met her in Gulu. I've lived in Gulu, northern Uganda for, I guess, 3 years now. So I moved there in 2018, but I've lived in Uganda since 2016. And then before that, I'd spent a year working in Tanzania. So I did undergrad at Ohio State, so fellow football school, and studied international development there. I had what's called a Boren Scholarship my junior year, which I bring up because it's an awesome opportunity if you're interested in this work. They basically give you $20,000 for a year to study a lesser spoken language. And so I used that to go to Tanzania, where I studied Swahili and I worked in child protection and kind of did some really interesting design work with a group of local leaders who were really passionate about child protection but didn't have good resources for getting getting information about child protection issues. And then I finished school and I moved to Uganda, initially with an organization called Village Enterprise. They do micro enterprise and microfinance development. Spent about 3 years with them. And then in 2019, kind of wanted to work for a smaller organization where I could kind of have a lot more breadth over what an organization was doing, and work with a really small team to grow something that I was really passionate about. So yeah, I've been at the Recreation Project since 2019. So I will just kind of go, I'm going to do a screen share. And I don't know who the host is, but I can't share yet. So I'll just get my thing organized.
Medha, it looks like you're the host. Can you add sharing ability?
Yeah, I'm working on that.
Awesome.
You should be able to share.
Beautiful. Okay. Let me go ahead and do that. Okay. Yeah, so the Recreation Project. So as Katie said, we're based in Gulu in northern Uganda. Our mission is to prepare young people to thrive through outdoor adventure and transformative play. So I'm going to go to this next slide. I know a lot of people aren't on video, but I think for people in our age bracket, this is probably a familiar logo. So when I was a junior in high school in Shaker Heights, Ohio, I was president of the Anti-Genocide Club, and Coney 2012 was like obviously a whole thing. Everybody watched it. It was Invisible Children was everywhere. Then, 8 or so years later, I end up moving to Gulu, Uganda, which is the location that was kind of the heartbeat of this conflict, which I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about from, I think Katie did a presentation about her work. It's very central to northern Uganda. So if you remember, it was this rebel group called the Lord's Resistance Army, terrorizing the entire region, highest use of child soldiers of any conflict, rape was a war weapon, child wives, really a horrible conflict. And the founder of the Recreation Project was working in Gulu at the time that the war was ending, which is like early 2000s. And basically as the war kind of comes to a close, the leaders are fleeing to Congo, South Sudan. There's just thousands and thousands of kids who had been abducted as rebels walking back from the bush, trying to come home to their villages. And the founder of the Recreation Project is a psychotherapist. He's from Denver, Colorado. And at the time, as you can imagine, post-conflict money is big money, right? So there's just millions and millions of dollars being poured into northern Uganda to fund rehabilitation and reintegration, which in the humanitarian world meant putting kids and their families who had been child soldiers into hotel ballrooms and writing on a flip chart about PTSD and reintegration theory. And shockingly, that wasn't working, right? And so the founder had grown up in Colorado. He, I live in Colorado, like my family's based in Colorado now, like this mountains and outside, that's just a part of the culture there. And so he had this vision of being able to offer active healing experiences for kids. So he came back to Denver, got a few friends on board, moved back to Gulu, and built what is now our home, which is a 5-acre outdoor adventure center in Gulu, which is like still a pretty small town in northern Uganda. So we have a climbing wall, we have a high rope course, and we have lots of space for kids to play and have fun. So for many years, kind of after its founding in 2010, the Recreation Project mostly worked with kids who had been directly affected by the war. They'd been abducted. Maybe they were children born in conflict. So we work with like a sponsorship program that children of Joseph Kony who were born to some of the wives that were abducted. But kind of fast forward to when I joined in 2019, the Recreation Project, the founder had left, they'd kind of gone through some ups and downs. And suddenly it's 2019 and northern Uganda has changed tremendously. I mean, it is not your post-conflict war-torn region, right? It's officially, Gulu is officially a city. It's, thriving economically. It's a trade hub of the North. And similarly, I'm sure as Katie has shared, that the ethnic group in northern Uganda is called the Acholi people. And I think the war in a lot of ways kind of has built the fabric of what their contemporary culture looks like. But it really doesn't define them. Like, I think there's sort of this acknowledgement of that it's part of them, it's part of who their story is, but there's really not like a big victim or, it's not like a victim mindset. It's people are very focused on joy, very focused on growth. And I felt like when I joined, we had to kind of reframe what we were doing, because obviously there's like appeal in, from a fundraising perspective, like post-conflict child soldiers, but that's really not what the context was. It definitely wasn't what the need was. And 70% of Uganda's population is under the age of 30. And people about our age, so like late 20s, early 30s, are really the last generation that has like a tangible exposed experience to the war. So you have 70% of the population under that age bracket that has no tangible personal memory of the war, but is immensely faces other extreme adversities that are maybe trickle down from the war, but also are part of living in a rapidly developing society. And so when I joined, we had to kind of reflect on how this amazing platform that we have of outdoor adventure, of play, of this amazing space that we get to call our home, how that could continue to be relevant and useful. And around that time, there was this body of research growing in the US. So 1990s, Kaiser Permanente sent out a checklist of 10 questions to 70,000 adults in the United States that asked about 11 adverse childhood experiences, which were basically physical abuse, sexual abuse, living with a parent with a mental health disorder, living with a parent with a substance abuse disorder, having a parent who had been incarcerated. And they got all the surveys back, and then they were able to correlate them with the health problems that they were seeing in the community. And what they saw is that facing adversity when you're a kid is directly correlated to heart disease, to cancer, to higher rates of teen pregnancy, higher rates of HIV contraction. Basically, the things that are killing us as adults are a lot of times being rooted in experiences that we had as children and living with chronic stress. And this body of research was kind of growing in the US, especially in California. The Surgeon General of California, Nadine Burke-Harris, is an awesome woman. She's written a book that I highly recommend. And I was reading her book and kind of learning about child development as I'd shifted careers, and looked around Gulu with my team and kind of felt like this clicks here. This is, there's a wide range of development issues people focus on, right? HIV, AIDS, teen pregnancy, and all of those things are important, but I think that makes development super siloed, right? And I was looking around and people are child protection as a sector, but there's not really like a day-to-day focus on giving kids healthy, thriving lives in order to allow them to be healthy and thriving adults in the same way that we really pour resources into HIV prevention. And so this kind of became our why, because conveniently there's like two things that are proven over and over to be the most effective things at both preventing and treating the impacts of childhood adversity. And that's loving and supportive relationships and building psychological resilience. I know a lot of people aren't on video here, but I'm curious for those that are, if anybody's read Angela Duckworth's book, Grit. If you haven't, okay, I'm seeing some nodding, some shaking their heads. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a great book. And part of the theory behind what we do is actually from her book. So she presents this equation in her book about how to build grit and resilience. And she says, controlled adversity plus opportunities for mastery equals grit and resilience. And I have this photo behind this slide because last summer during like the height of the pandemic, I was in Colorado with my family. We were hiking one weekend and it was just as like the fires in Colorado were out of control. And I was thinking about this idea of controlled burning. So as fires get more and more out of hand every year, we're returning to indigenous practices of like actually the best way to prevent wildfires in these areas is to have controlled burns in different areas to prevent fires from spreading and decimating an entire region. And as we were hiking in the smoke, I was like, that is the perfect analogy for what we do at the Recreation Project, because our goal is to prevent that uncontrolled hundreds and millions of acres burned, right? Our goal is to prevent kids from having serious mental health issues, to having lives that feel like they're spiraling. But the best way to do that isn't to cut them off and give them this safe little life in a bubble, right? The best way to prepare them to overcome adversity is to give them controlled adversity. So that could be things, I think if we as adults, having maybe some of us growing up in the West or from more privileged backgrounds outside of the West, we going to summer camp, right? That's controlled adversity, leaving your family for a week, playing a sport and having to try something over and over and go to like summer training. That's controlled adversity. Doing music and trying to like learn a new skill. That's controlled adversity and opportunities for mastery. So I like to say like this formula really is the building blocks of who we are as humans with identities, right? And so our goal is really to provide these experiences that offer controlled adversity and opportunities for mastery, because that's going to build grit and resilience. So this is kind of our model of how we do that. So we run a 15-week program that's kind of built around these 10 modules that we developed. We call them resilience education. They're all play-based modules. So we have a no chalkboard rule at the Recreation Project. So we don't, it's just quite common. There's a few NGOs that I won't mention by name, but that do sort of like entrepreneurship or like life skills trainings that get kids into a room that they've been sitting in all day. And there's, 100 kids sitting in a classroom and somebody goes up and writes how to be a leader. Like, this is what a dictatorship leadership model looks like. This is what a democratic leadership model looks like. And we don't do that. We have a no chalkboard rule. So we get kids out and they start rock climbing and they go on our zip line and we bring games and we go to their schools and do physical education classes to teach them and let them experience what good leadership or conflict resolution or building positive relationships looks like. I'm going to come back to a little bit more about our modules in a second, but we also have 3 touch points throughout those 15 weeks with parents and guardians. So obviously we can do as much as we can in 15 weeks. there's this whole ecosystem that surrounds kids that really starts at home. And so we provide training for parents and guardians about adverse childhood experiences, but kind of the more important part of those touch points is we just give kids and parents an opportunity to play together and talk to each other and have one-on-one time and talk about how they make decisions in the household. The other element is pro-social involvement, which is like such an academic way of saying like doing things with other people for the good of something better bigger than yourself, has been shown to be really effective in building resilience in young people. And so we have each group of 15 kids that goes through our program together, identifies a problem in their community, then they design a way that they want to solve it, and then we give them the resources to do it. So like one of my favorite examples of this is during like Uganda's strictest lockdown in 2020, we were working with kids who were out of school in this area called Lukodi, which is where Katie's husband does some of his research, particularly like violent history during the war. And the kids felt like their community didn't have enough awareness and resources to practice good hygiene to prevent the spread of COVID. And so they built like hand washing stations in different public areas in their training center. And then last but not least, we kind of like to end our 15 weeks with like this heightened experience of controlled adversity. So we do an adventure excursion with all of our kids. So that could mean a couple different things. We run some programs for older youth that are really built around outdoor adventure and climbing. So they learn technical rock climbing skills, they learn to rappel, to belay, to set their ropes. And then at the end, we take them on a wilderness camping weekend and they have to go climb in the wild. But for our younger kids who we do physical education classes with, or we work with the juvenile detention center, those kids then get to come to our site that I showed you earlier and spend the day there and do all of the high ropes activities. I just want to talk for a second about our modules and kind of how we designed them. So I personally am really interested in design thinking and human-centered design and kind of where that intersects and needs to intersect more with international development. And so one of the ways that we kind of took advantage of the downtime during the pandemic is we wanted to redesign the way that we built our training. And so all of our staff interviewed 5 people that were just around them, cousins, sisters, brothers, neighbors, and they asked each of those people to give an example of somebody that they knew that was thriving and what that meant to them. They also had to ask what skills that person had needed to achieve their greatest success and overcome their greatest challenge. And then from there, we like used grounded theory to code them and categorize them. And from that, we were able to emerge with these 10 like life skills that were clearly important to all of like based on those interviews. And then within those setting learning objectives that we felt like we could capture during our 2 hours of that session. And so then our staff know like thousands of PE and camp games, basically like games you guys have probably played at a team building retreat sometimes. And so they then assign a game to a learning objective. So that's kind of how our trainings are set up. So I kind of wanted to give an example of what this looks like in reality. So this girl, this is Simple. So she is a graduate of our climbing club program, which is for youth who are at risk. So like kids that have been like challenged in their neighborhoods, maybe they're referred to us by a local leader. Katie knows a group of these kids, we call them the Lacho bad boys. So Lacho is like the neighborhood where we hang out, and well, in their words, they were notorious for like they ran a car wash and they were just kind of vulgar to other people. They drank a lot, like, so they got referred by somebody in the community. So this is like a group of kids who probably aren't in school. They had to drop out early and they're kind of aimless, right? 70% of the population is under 30 and unemployment is just completely rampant. And so to have like a productive thing for people to do, we open up on Thursdays and Fridays, and we have cohorts. So 30 kids come at a time to do our climbing club program, which is our 15-week trainings, and they learn the climbing. But then we also are open, you know, anytime for them to come after they've graduated, and they can come and climb and boulder and just have like a good, fun, safe place to be. So Simple is 25, and she has 3 boys, 3 kids, and she joined because she never finished school and just like didn't really have a ton to do, wasn't working. And as you can imagine, this group of kids in general, like they're a bit disenfranchised. Okay, so imagine that then times 5, that you're a girl and you're a single mom and you're trying rock climbing, right? Which even in the US, that's like intimidating for most women or people that like maybe don't fit in immediately at the climbing gym. And so she came, and she was like really kind of nervous at first and struggled a little bit. She was never the first person to try something. And then at the end, they go on their climbing excursion. She finally rappels. They have to rappel down this 30-meter cliff. And she gets to the end, and she like turns to one of our facilitators, and she says like, I never knew women could sweat like this. She was like, I am so sweaty. Like, I've never sweated like this before. And it was just a good example of like, yeah, that this is something that just put her so outside of her comfort zone, but gave her a sense of accomplishment. And a couple of months ago, I guess a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in our forest, like working in our office during a climbing club session. And I hear this like female voice, like yelling and laughing. And I turned to my coworker and I was like, who is that? And they were like, that's Simple. And I like went out, and Simple was back visiting the new climbers, and she was like wearing her climbing club t-shirt, and she was like correcting the boys on how to belay and like yelling encouragements to everybody. And I like went up to her and I was like, is that the same Simple that I know? Like, it was like total night and day of like the girl that came in on our first day and was like really shy and didn't want to try anything. And I just thought that's the best example of she tried something new and hard, and she went back every week. She found somebody to sit with her kids, and she got to master something, right? She got this opportunity to become good at something and to be able to go. And then because of that, she like has this new confidence that she didn't necessarily have before. And I just love that as an example of that equation from Angela Duckworth's book. So I want to talk a bit about like how we measure this stuff, because I think this is something I think about all the time. Average person I talk to about this isn't that interested in the M&E for resilience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what this looks like on the back end to measure. So resilience is kind of traditionally broken down into 2 parts. So it's your internal resilience aspects, which are problem-solving skills, being socially competent, having a sense of autonomy and a sense of purpose. And then also your external protective factors. So you need to have good relationships and support at home, at school, in your peer group, and then in your community. And so we kind of worked for a long time to decide what the best way to measure this stuff is. And obviously there's no perfect way to measure something that's super subjective. Like, I think if we asked everybody on this call, are you a resilient person? You know, that's a big question. Even I eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, and I don't know that I would have a great answer for that, right? And I also definitely don't think there's an objective way to measure it. But so much of what we do, right, is trying to find these proxy indicators to measure something objective that can then be an indicator of whether we're having any subjective progress or impact. And so we kind of adapted a couple of tools that have been used and validated statistically in other areas. So one is called the Child and Youth Resilience Measure. One is called the California Healthy Kids Survey. And those are both a series of self-report questions for baseline and endline that look at each of these factors. And so we do that at baseline, at end line, and then we do a 1-year follow-up. And so the data that we've gotten back so far shows like overall a 40% increase in resilience, usually higher on the internal side than the external side, which we're kind of using to think like maybe we need to do more with the interactions that we have with parents. Maybe we need to do more with teachers, who are the community members that our kids engage with. And yeah, and it also differs across programs. So we run physical education programs with 6th graders, and we run these programs like Climbing Club. And the physical education has a lower overall score than the Climbing Club, which just makes sense, right? You probably got a lot more out of summer camp or playing a sport than you did from PE class. And so we're just always trying to find a balance of like, okay, that doesn't mean we need to stop doing PE classes. That's a really good like breadth opportunity to get to a lot of kids, but then maintaining ways that we really can get some depth. So I want to kind of end with, I was sort of thinking about like what, I don't know, if there was like a specific thing I wanted to talk about. And I just thought, especially because all of you are kind of in some way, you know, interested or working in international development and studying it, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about like what I think development in practice means, because I studied international development in undergrad. I like loved it, found it so interesting, did a ton of like theory, post-colonial Marxist development stuff. So it was like super in the like academic space. And then I started working in development, and like nobody wanted to talk about an agrarian revolution. And also but that didn't mean that background and theory wasn't important. And so I kind of wanted to talk about like all of the different things that happen at the recreation projects that probably connect to different things that you're thinking about or learning about or are interested in doing. So I think I'll kind of talk a little bit about each of these. So we get to do a lot of like positive youth development and child development and resilience theory, and constantly my team is like reading articles and reading books and seeing, you know, something that sparks our interest about, oh, this organization in South Africa that uses surfing does this one thing, maybe we could do it. Or we, you know, have this peer organization that does literacy, and during our COVID lockdown, they were doing small group home-based learning. So we were like, well, how can we, you know, adapt our model to that? And so we do a lot of thinking about, you know, international development in a lot of ways is just human development in international places, right? And so we think a lot about human development and get to engage with literature and researchers about what's effective in getting kids and youth and humans to develop positively. But I think then on the other side, we also do a lot of like the maybe less exciting stuff, right? I do a lot of proposal writing and a lot of figuring out what we should post on Instagram, working with my team to find, you know, good stories. I'm back in the US right now because I was doing a series of like small events to raise money for us. And then, you know, a lot of our time is also spent cutting through red tape, right? Like we have to, you know, develop relationships with local governments. I spent like my entire summer trying to get an approval letter stamped and signed by the right person so that we could still operate during lockdown. We're currently trying to renew our NGO permit. So that's the pendulum swings the other way. Then, you know, you kind of go back to the other way. And like, I do think a lot, and I think probably all of you have too, in the past couple of years, as you're engaging with this, we talk a lot about, okay, who's making the decisions here, right? Who's driving what it means to be resilient or what it means to thrive? And, you know, how are we at the Recreation Project with $100,000 a year, like reinforcing power dynamics and colonial legacies and, you know, propping up like unproximate leadership and decision-making. And so we're thinking a lot about our leadership transitions over the next couple of years, because I'm actually moving back to the US, and I'll be working part-time and going to grad school, but really focusing on fundraising. but we're hiring a Ugandan country director who's more proximate to that community, to our mission, to our, team, to be able to drive decision making and programming in the field. And so, one day we're really thinking about that, and then the pendulum swings back the other way, and maybe we're doing more. I do a lot of I'm really interested in management and leadership, and so thinking a lot about, well, how do we develop a really efficient but effective and well-rounded team? What does it look like to manage a team of Ugandans versus a team of Americans? And how can we, make sure everybody's better and build our team really effectively? And then we think a lot about what our program looks like. What is the need? I mentioned that example earlier of how we use grounded theory, what it means to thrive, what it means to measure all of that stuff. But I'm sure if any of you have worked in M&E, I know Katie and I really bonded this summer because we love thinking about this stuff and this stuff, but on a day-to-day basis, somebody's got to figure out how to use Kobo Toolbox and Salesforce. And so a lot of my time is spent making Stata do files and teaching my colleagues how to use Stata. And so you kind of get this super interesting realm of getting to touch all the things. And I just wanted to share that because I think, especially working at a small organization, I really like that. And part of why I left the big organization is I wanted to get to spend some days working on Stata and some days thinking about what anti-racism means in an international development context, and other days talking to students at US about what our work is. So I think that's kind of just a picture of what I think development looks like in practice, because I think when I started, I just didn't really know what to expect. And I think it's a really exciting amalgamation of all of the different things that you might get to think about, or just even maybe don't think about when you're going to school for this. I think the last thing I wanted to share before we do questions is I did want to talk a little bit about what Katie mentioned, which is some interesting opportunities that we have and that we offer to students. So there's kind of two routes here. One is an internship for field practicum that maybe is a bit more hands-on, a bit more in practice, and then others that are more research opportunities that I think could also be a field practicum. And we're really open any semester, but I think for remote, but I think the in-person one is probably the most interesting, and that obviously is easiest over the summer. So I, having done a lot of internships in international development, and also considering the ethics and reasoning of needing, people coming from an American university to do an internship in international development. And so what I really try and do is do very specific project-based deliverables for these, which I think helps everybody because we get something done that we otherwise would normally hire a consultant for. But you also get a very specific experience that you get to do from start to finish. So I'll give you an example. Is we have a pretty good relationship with the Masters in Development program at Georgetown. And we had an awesome intern in summer of 2020 who literally built what is now our monitoring and evaluation system. So when we're using the do files or the surveys in Kobo Toolbox, a lot of it is stuff that she built. We're also potentially looking some current project opportunities are things to think about. We're looking at an early childhood development program to be offering play-based learning opportunities for younger kids. As I mentioned, we're looking at our parent and family interventions to think about how we can use human-centered design to improve those and really look at our external resilience indicators growth around there. And yeah, we also are in the midst of a grounded theory study to better understand what it means to thrive in this community and how we can kind of build an M&E level of measurement that looks at that in a more qualitative way. And from a more research perspective, which maybe would be a master's or maybe PhD or faculty level, we're really interested in, first of all, doing the adverse childhood experience survey with our participants and our community. That grounded theory is on there. And then kind of looking as well at helping us figure out, we do our outcomes measurement and then we deliver our program, but we really don't have like monitoring and adaptive management tools in between to say, like, for example, you know, how many times one of our facilitators uses a participant's name and during a training might be a good indicator for how strong they're building a relationship, so that ultimately they're able to say, like, they, you know, they have a good relationship with an adult outside of their home. And so we're really interested in kind of having a set of 5 or 6 indicators that we can monitor for that are then kind of proxies for where we go. Yeah, so I will kind of stop there and ask if anybody has, I don't know if you guys usually do like questions anybody can ask, if you have like planned questions. I'll stop there.